Hello, for those of you who've already logged in, you're joining the ICER webinar on leveraging ICER Analytics on gene therapies for hemophilia A and B. We're going to give people 1 minute to come into the webinar, and we'll get started then. Okay, hi. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Steve Pearson, and I'm going to be leading the introduction and part of this webinar. But welcome to those of you who are coming in again. Some of you are subscribers to the ICER Analytics platform. Some of you have been introduced to it, but are not yet subscribers. So we decided to do a public webinar that would allow both sets of folks to hear some further thoughts on how to apply it in different policy situations. So I'm Steve Pearson, as I mentioned, the president of ICER, and following me will be Sarah Emond, who's our executive vice president and chief operating officer. So again, almost all of you, I'm sure, know who we are at ICER. We're an independent health technology assessment group. We've been in existence for about 16 years now, and we develop publicly available value assessment reports, not just on drugs, but also on medical tests, treatments, and delivery system innovations. We're best known perhaps for using cost effectiveness as well as comparative clinical effectiveness. And we use cost effectiveness to help calculate what we call value-based price benchmarks. And we also feel it's important to have this work be very publicly transparent and to try to involve all stakeholders, including the general public, in broader discussions around how we assess value, how we link that into a healthcare system that also robustly supports innovation and fair access to new treatments for patients. Our reports are used in a lot of different ways, different times. We make them publicly available. We'll talk about the ICER Analytics part, but our reports being public, they can be used in lots of different ways. Drug makers have used them to triangulate, if you will, on their launch prices. They work on it, and obviously for many years before our reports get started. But they do use it when they are thinking about the final phase, and also they take our reports into consideration in different ways when they're thinking about price increases. Our work is used by at the state level by prescription drug affordability boards when they're trying to, in some cases, come up with upper payment limits. Broader Medicaid programs use it in their P&T processes, as does the Veterans Association, which has published and spoken extensively about their use of our work as kind of a complement to their own work when they think about their formulary, and in particular when they're negotiating prices. For private insurers and pharmacy benefit managers, again, lots of different uses, and it ranges from the formulary development side, which you could call, I guess, the P&T committee elements, the internal dossiers, et cetera. Kind of externally focused use in price negotiation and considerations around value-based outcomes agreements. And both payers and plan sponsors are increasingly using our reports as, I guess you could consider it, a foundation for considering different kinds of benefit designs, things around how to structure not just the internal decision-making around tiering for formularies, but the broader design of benefits in the pharmaceutical space. So then why ICER Analytics? Several reasons. First, what it is, it's a cloud-based platform that facilitates the use of our work and its underlying analyses, and I'll talk about the different uses. But the why is important for those of you who are not current subscribers and haven't heard about this before, because again, our work remains in the public domain, but we recognized some limitations. One is that as the work accumulated, it was getting harder and harder to find things, to rapidly compare what ICER said about this autoimmune kind of set of drugs for one indication versus another, or for one gene therapy across time. And so there was a finding issue, and being able to rapidly do that in a way that could enable folks to also kind of reflect on how their experience was matching up with what ICER suggested. So there was a kind of a finding and using function. And the other was the real desire to kind of democratize the ability to consider assumptions and updates to our work. And that's the ICER Interactive Modeler platform in particular that Sarah will walk you through. But it allows, again, the concept was to allow people to put in different assumptions into the economic model kind of backbone that ICER has developed in order to do a variety of different things. Again, to disagree with ICER's assumptions, to explore alternatives, and in particular, to be able to use real-world evidence and new even clinical trial evidence to update the findings in a way that could inform kind of a specific new look, along with the ability to change costs and other things in a very kind of user-specific way, so that you could really tailor it to your environment, your cost structure, your patient population. There are other uses for it from the life science side in terms of forecasting, looking years in advance, in many cases, the ways that the evidence would need to be developed to support certain pricing assumptions, or to, if you want to reverse engineer that, to say what price would meet certain cost effectiveness thresholds with an early assumption around the clinical effectiveness. So that was kind of the big picture why. And again, what we're hearing and what our hopes have been is that it can be useful in ways that our PDF reports cannot fully be, to help people develop innovative benefit designs, really kind of work it through the different parts of designing formularies, to help plan that drug development kind of evidence generation platform. And then again, ultimately to also help think through the value-based approach to drug pricing and to use it as a platform between all stakeholders to help negotiate and consider drug reimbursement approaches. So now I'm going to do a part of the demonstration of how this works, and we're going to focus on the hemophilia gene therapies. And so let me stop sharing this part, and I will reshare the online platform. All right, with great hopes that you are now seeing what you should see, which says ICER Analytics, 2 tools in 1. So I'm going to walk through the evidence compendium side, which is pretty much what it sounds like, but I'll show you what it can do. And then Sarah will take over and talk through the uses of the interactive modeler. And we will have Q&A at the end. So feel free to, at any time during this webinar, to submit a question, and we will certainly try to triage those and get to them as we can. So let me go in, actually, even before I go into the evidence compendium, I should scroll down, because on this welcoming page, we have an important set of resources for subscribers. And one of the most important things that we're finding that people value are our early insights webinars. And these are done for subscribers only at the time that ICER launches or posts its draft reports. And that's usually about 4 months prior to the anticipated FDA approval date. But we heard and acknowledged that payers, especially for the more prominent expected launches, are already thinking through their approach to formulary determinations, et cetera. So with our draft report, even though it is draft, we felt that it would be helpful for us to walk through what we had learned up to that point. And so we do these webinars. The most recent one, as you can see, was on the latest evidence on the new set of emerging drugs for Alzheimer's disease, lecanemab and donanemab. But if you go into kind of other videos, we have, if I clicked into these featured webinars, I guess I can do this, take you straight through to the others. Before that one, we had one that was on our update to the value-based pricing of Paxlovid. And this was just on the platform. This was an example in which we felt that there was a policy relevant reason to do an update given the shifting evidence on the background risks of COVID infection, et cetera. So we did a relatively rapid update based on our assessment of the evidence at the current time. And instead of putting out, a PDF, et cetera, what we did is we created a webinar in which we actually walked through inserting the new evidence into the backbone of the economic model to produce an updated value-based price. And the punchline, which many of you know, is that given the dropping background risk of hospitalization and death from COVID in the Omicron era, of course, this could always change, but in that more recent view of the risks of hospitalization and death, and with some other assumptions around the long COVID aspects, et cetera, our value-based price range for Paxlovid fell considerably from in the 3,000s down to less than 1,000. So if you want all the details on that, all you have to do if you're a subscriber is go watch that relatively short webinar. And again, it both shows you how ICER has used it to make an update, but it really emphasizes the point that you have this tool. We didn't update the cost structure of what a cost of a hospital day is. And for one payer versus another versus a delivery system, those numbers will be different. And so you can tailor it. And again, we really hope that people view this not just as a passive tool through which ICER will tell you what we think. It's really a tool for you to tailor results and to have further conversations, both internally and again, with external folks, be it the drug maker or others. So let me then go back. There are other things here. There are other demo videos here for people, again, who want to get kind of even deeper into the weeds than we will get today on certain aspects of each of the platforms. And these are all here, and they're done at the kind of 101 level for people who are new to the platform. So you can go in and refresh your understanding of how to use it in different ways, different elements of the platform. These are all here through relatively short demonstration videos. Okay, so now going back up to my primary task, which was to share the evidence compendium with a focus on the hemophilia gene therapies. So first, though, when you click into this evidence compendium, it will bring up an alphabetized list of all of the drugs that ICER has reviewed. I believe we're well over 150 drugs now, but I forget the exact date to which it extends going backwards. And you can search for drugs any way you want to, by the trade name, by the generic name, by the condition. All of these will alphabetize. You can look for all the drugs made by a specific manufacturer. So again, compared to trying to rifle through our voluminous PDF reports through the years, this allows you to do a lot of things quickly that you could not do otherwise. You can also search. So if I just want to look at hemophilia drugs, there they are. And they're generally laid out in a chronologic review as well, a chronologic level, as well as a kind of alphabetized level here based on trade name. And we're going to focus again on the more recent reports we've done, but you have here older reports from 2020, even 2018. Sometimes those are in different populations or different comparators, so you can kind of see what the focus of the review was at that time. And each row in the evidence compendium really does give you some of the very basic aspects of what you would want to know: the method of administration, the manufacturer, whether it's breakthrough or orphan, and all the way up to our evidence rating and our annual dosage assumptions. You can always download any part of the kind of evidence compendium or even the whole thing as an Excel workbook to work, if you will, kind of offline to share with others, to do other kinds of manipulation, et cetera. So let me just go through then. I'm going to focus on the gene therapy Hemgenix. Atronacogene is what we use to kind of shorthand for the generic name. But I'm going to click into this one after I show you how you can use it to compare your own pricing, which is one of the first things that many people from the payer side, at least, think of wanting to do with the evidence compendium. So if I click, I want to look at my price as Plan A for this drug. Now, what you see here is still, it's a little bit hard, so let me kind of orient you. But you've got in this row the date of the review, the population, and the comparator. You've got the annual dosing assumptions. And then you've got this thing here that it says, this row is ICER's price to meet different cost effectiveness thresholds. So these are the pieces of our report that come out from the cost effectiveness model that suggest what a fair price would be at different cost effectiveness thresholds. And you can tailor this. This shows both the findings at the different thresholds per quality, per added quality adjusted life year, and at the equal value life year gained. Some of you will not know exactly what those distinctions are, and you can go into our reports and learn more. But these numbers here, and you can enter in your price. You can also kind of tailor this by customizing. And if I want to simplify it right now, let's say I only want to see the pricing threshold results at 100,000 to 150,000. So I'll just simplify that. I can see both the modified societal perspective. That's the one that kind of tries to reach beyond the health sector to count costs and effects in productivity at work, sometimes other kind of broader societal factors. I'll leave both of those there for right now. So right now, let's say, again, I've thinned it out just to show the 100 to 150 per quality and equal value life year gain. I'll just kind of focus your eyes, if you will, on the health system perspective per quality for now, but you can pick the equal value life year gained. So you can see that the value-based price range right now from our original report ranged between 2.9 million and 2.958. So in that, it's a pretty close range, actually, for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into. Sometimes there's a much bigger kind of range between 100 to 150. But the purpose here, and you can think of it, in other situations in which you might have a lot of different drugs that you wanted to compare your negotiated price to what ICER said the price would be to meet different cost effectiveness thresholds. But we know that the company has announced a $3.5 million kind of launch price, and that's not including, the kind of any outcomes-based agreement, et cetera. But any price you type in here, you will automatically calculate what further reduction, if any, is needed to get to that value-based price threshold. So this is just shown with one drug in which, again, you can imagine doing this in a crowded class where you're looking at a lot of different autoimmune drugs for a condition, let's say, and you can line this up. You can publish a quick kind of visual graphic of how the actual price is comparing to the range suggested by the ICER report. You can offload these for use with your internal kind of PowerPoint or whatever you're using. The last part of the evidence compendium I wanted to show you was if I click on the drug itself at any time, I get taken to our kind of key takeaways page. And we envision this page as being, in many ways, the fastest way to get the basic, most important information that you would need, particularly if you're thinking about a P&T committee or an internal kind of dossier approach to our report. Because what we have here is a de novo just for the platform. This doesn't come from our public meeting or anything. We create a special, usually 10 to 12 minute PowerPoint webinar that is, in a sense, if we were talking to a P&T committee, what we think they would want to know the most. So it's a kind of quick, right, to the evidence with patient perspectives also woven in, but it talks about clinical experts, role in therapy, and then it goes to the evidence on the clinical and the cost effectiveness. So you get that in 10 to 12 minutes. You also have these documents. You have these slides if you want to download them as a PowerPoint. So it's very easy for you to manipulate and use with your P&T committee or whomever else you want to kind of show the slides to, and you can change them at your will. We have our report at a glance, which is in a sense a visualized, slightly more lay description of an executive summary of the report. The evidence summary is what, if you've ever seen a P&T committee and how their work is usually teed up, they almost always do have a kind of a table of the key pivotal trial results, describing the patient characteristics, the key outcome measures, and the key findings. So we have that all teed up from our report, the key tables representing the evidence from the pivotal trials and any other evidence that's central to thinking about value. Very unique to ICER's work is our curated patient perspectives document here, which comes from the general report. But again, it helps folks understand. So in hemophilia B, for instance, what would you find in the patient perspectives document? You would find a very rich, but still succinct description of the impact of this condition on their lives from childhood through adulthood. Things that you, even as a clinician, that I wouldn't have, I didn't care directly for hemophilia patients, and maybe that's one reason, but even when it's been conditions that I did care for, I always learned something that I didn't know. And it's about the diversity of the experience. It's about, for hemophilia B, they talk a lot about how bleeds are not the only thing that matters to them and their quality of life. They talk a lot about the fact that as they progress from childhood through adolescence to adulthood, that their approach to prophylaxis changes because they might be picking up a new sport. So suddenly a patient who didn't need prophylaxis and was doing okay might be requesting prophylaxis because they've just joined a soccer team. So there are things that you learn about the course of the illness that are really central, we think, to a broader view of value. So we hope that that's often used and to expand the view that policymakers have of value. And then we do have a recommendations for fair pricing and fair access. This document gets into the weeds on what plans are likely to think about, payers are going to be thinking about when they frame their coverage, for instance. So for hemophilia, we go pretty deep into what's the thinking around how an outcomes-based agreement would be framed. What outcomes? And what are the considerations around a patient who starts to bleed a little bit after having gene therapy? We also heard from the patients that they were worried that if they started to bleed, that payers might not want to allow factor treatments because you'd just be loading cost on top of cost. But there are those issues talked about throughout. Step therapy. We talk about, in this case, for hemophilia B, there really is no other treatment that could be considered a step therapy. But deep in the weeds of this, if you will, are some critical factors. Now, we are not trying to say how it has to be, but what we want to do is to capture the input from clinical experts, key patient groups that arise from our policy roundtable and other sources, and try to frame the perspectives that policymakers need to think through. So it's going to be important in this case for payers to think about, are they going to frame a level of severity of hemophilia that would merit coverage for a gene therapy? This has already come up with emicizumab. Do they have to have a number of bleeds or a factor level that's low enough, quote unquote? And we walk through how clinical experts and patient groups and others weigh these factors as they try to think through what does it mean if we're trying to create a category of mild hemophilia that might not get coverage for a gene therapy. And again, we really do talk through the pros and cons, the perspectives that need to be considered as the plans in particular will be thinking about that when they're making their coverage. All right. Also, if you ever do want to watch, if you didn't see it in the flesh, you can always watch kind of segmented elements from our public meetings. So if you wanted to see the policy roundtable where all that was discussed with top clinical experts and patient groups, it's right there. If you want to see how our P&T committee, if you will, our independent appraisal committee wrestled with the evidence and discussed different potential other benefits outside the clinical evidence, you can see that. You can see public comments from the manufacturer, et cetera. So that's all in the key snapshots page in the evidence compendium. And that's just one half of the ICER Analytics platform. So let me stop sharing now and let Sarah walk you through the interactive modeler part of the ICER Analytics platform. Sarah?
Thank you very much, Steve, for that overview of the evidence compendium. And now we'll switch over to the interactive modeler. So what we have done with the interactive modeler is create a platform with the express goal of recognizing the fact that the information that we use at the time of our report is a snapshot in time. It is meant to inform conversations about the fairness of launch pricing, what clinical evidence we have, how we know that should be, or what we know about how that should be impacting decision-making for patients, their families, and their clinicians. But data evolve. We get new information, whether it's real world data, real world evidence, whether it's a post approval clinical trial, that information often exists after the fact. So the interactive modeler is a place where that information can be inputted. The interactive modeler is also a place where you can tailor the inputs to better reflect your population. When we do our models, we use averages. What is the average cost of treating a bleed if we're talking about the hemophilia population? When we're talking about the COVID model, what's the average cost of an ICU visit? We know that those costs vary depending on the payer, the purchaser, the environment. So that's what the interactive modeler, that's the impetus for why we developed it. All right, so what we have here are all of the models that are in the modeler right now, nearing 40, where you can scroll alphabetically to click into. You could sort by just looking at everything that we have done in a particular disease area, or you can even say, I want to look at the very specific disease area like hemophilia. So today we're actually going to look at the hemophilia A model. This is the most recent model. And this is for Valrox, not yet approved, but the gene therapy for potentially for hemophilia A. And what we're going to walk through using hemophilia as an example is how to use the interactive modeler. All right, so first things first, let's get oriented to the platform. The left-hand side over here, this is the gray side. This is where you can change things. This side over here, the white, this is how the answer, so to speak, will change with new inputs. So what you see when you log into the platform are what was considered the base case scenario that we used, the scenario where we made specific judgments on inputs, on perspectives to say what we think a fair price should be. Before I start changing anything, let's just see what that says. All right, so I'm going to orient you with all of the inputs that we had worked with the manufacturer and the patient groups and clinicians on. We have an incremental cost effectiveness ratio. Down here is the quadrant I spend a lot of time looking at when I'm in the interactive modeler, pretty high, right? We talk about cost per quality thresholds and cost per equal value life year thresholds of 100,000 to 150,000. Steve mentioned that in his section. So now we're in the 5 millions with some base case assumptions. If I wanted to know just right now without doing anything else, what does this mean ICER thinks a fair price is, then I would go to the price benchmark tab, and you could look here to see what this means for the price benchmark, reflecting all of the inputs that you've put in. So right now, this is, again, the base case that ICER had. We've got 1.95 to 1.955 as our range of fair price. Okay, great. This page will update as you change things. So at any point when you're working in the interactive modeler and you've made some key assumption changes to reflect either your population or new evidence, this is where you go to find out what is the new calculation for the fair price. And a lot of people like to do a snapshot of this, put it in a PowerPoint deck for a presentation. It could be a conversation between a manufacturer and a payer negotiating price and access. So let's take a look at all of the parts of the left-hand side on the cost effectiveness model. We have settings. In a lot of our models, these settings are going to be things that you might not change much. You might be interested in comparing between a healthcare system perspective and a modified societal perspective. And you saw that the right-hand side automatically updated, made it look a little bit better. You could be interested in a discount rate if you're a researcher doing health economics. But in most models, this section, just as a spoiler alert, there's not a lot to change. However, this model's kind of fun. This is an area where I think a lot of users will enjoy being able to take a look at how, quote unquote, the answer changes based on some really key assumptions. So one thing about the hemophilia space, and in this particular, for this particular treatment, is that the calculation of a value-based price, a fair price, is driven almost entirely by cost offsets, not by health gain. And you can see that over here We're using emicizumab as the comparator in this model. And with Valrox, you do have some health gain, but 0.1 QALYs in this example. You could switch and look, and it's actually the same because there's no life extension. So it's the same value for equal value life years. Okay, so it's better than emicizumab, but not a ton better. But you have also a pretty big number over here in terms of the incremental increase in costs. So that's why you get an incremental cost effectiveness ratio that's pretty high. So in a scenario where most of the value is driven by cost offsets, and there's questions about whether or not those things you are offsetting, how they sort of rank on cost effectiveness, on fairness of price, then it makes sense for the user to alter some of those assumptions. Now, one of the things we did as our base case in this scenario is we capped the amount of savings that can accrue to the benefit of the company through their price at $150,000 per year. So that's the base case example we have, is capping that. But we want users to be able to make their own choices about what is fair for their particular system or for their particular model. You could say, I want to share the savings equally. Any cost offsets that happen over the lifetime of a patient cohort going through this model, 50% go to society, 50% go to the manufacturer. Well, look what that does to the answer. This red box is a reminder that when incremental cost effectiveness ratios go negative, it means we're in a scenario where it's actually better and cost saving, right? So that changes the answer dramatically. There's no reason to go over here and see what the price is, because whatever price you're paying, if you're getting incremental cost effectiveness ratios like this, that means that's fair. All right, but let's look at another scenario. What if we thought actually society should accrue all of the savings, and that we should judge this product only on the health benefit that it's bringing to patients? Now you've got incremental cost effectiveness ratios that have gone up from the original base case I showed you. And if you went over to the price benchmark tab, then you can see that we think a fair price with those assumptions is more like $300,000 a year, not 1.9 million. And the third scenario here, because we already looked at the 150, is a full cost offset. This means you give credit to all of the cost savings that a therapy brings to the manufacturer. And now you've got that red note again telling you you're in a situation where you've got something that's more effective and costs less. So as a user of this platform, specifically in the hemophilia space, you might find it interesting to work through these different scenarios just on this setting tab, or after you've made some adjustments, and we'll go through what these other tabs are, in order to see how it quote unquote changes the answer for you and your population. All right, what we're going to do for the other playing around is I'm actually going to go back to the original scenario on the settings tab. We'll also note these blue boxes are helpful as you're navigating the platform. For those health economists in the audience, you know there's a lot of explanation that goes around some of the assumptions that need to be made or why the model behaves a particular way. Any blue box is clickable. It'll give you some background information and often will lead you to a specific reference if that's necessary. In this model, the epidemiology, we've decided to lock anytime you can't modify an input. It's because we've judged that doing so would sort of break the logic of the model, right? So there'll be other models in our platform where you can change the average age, the percent female, but not in this model. And I will say in this model, the clinical inputs are very specific to these Pedersen scores that are specific to measuring benefit and effectiveness in the hemophilia population. You can expect in some of our other models, the clinical space is a great place to be putting in some real world evidence, some data from a post-marketing trial, because you can be modeling what happens when we have better evidence about effectiveness and even harms and how that quote unquote changes the answer. The quality of life tab is really for the researchers out there, those who are studying the patient-centered outcomes that are in the hemophilia space. So these are what the utilities are for the different disease areas. So this would be a place if you had some more information and you wanted to update, and you can see how that changes the answer again. The tab that gets a lot of use is the cost tab. And this is what I was referencing in the beginning. Because we're using averages when we're talking about our base case across an entire population, different types of payers, different regions, we know that nuance gets lost. And so this would be a case where if you knew specifically what you were paying for emicizumab in your population, either through the rebates and discounts you've negotiated or just because of other arrangements with the manufacturer, you can put those numbers in here and see how it changes the answer. So say you're actually paying more than what we put in as the base case. You can see in that case, the cost effectiveness actually gets a little bit better, right? Because you're offsetting more expensive care, even with the cost offset cap of 150,000. That would be what we would expect to see in a model like this. If you have the data to show how much it's costing to treat some of the things that we know happen to patients with hemophilia, then you could add that in here. And this is a place where I know in like the COVID model and some of the other models where a lot of the value is derived by avoiding hospitalizations, avoiding patients going into expensive intensive care units, having data on exactly what that costs in your population is really helpful to know how it changes the calculation of a fair price. The other things I'll highlight on the platform that are not specific to hemophilia, but you'll find in every model, the executive summary, where after you've made some changes, you're able to see what that's done to the answer of what we're looking at in terms of cost effectiveness, what kind of incremental benefit are we seeing, and the potential budget impact, which we'll get to in just a minute. We also have a one-way sensitivity analysis. So if you wanted to see which factors were driving the answer, so to speak, in the model, the one-way sensitivity analysis is a great place to see that. The probabilistic sensitivity analysis is coming soon. It's a feature that's under development, and you can always open up and see what did we do. These are the abstraction of the actual methods from the ICER report. You can always see the list of references that we used, and in several places, you can always go back and open up the entire model, the entire report, so you can read it in detail. The other thing that I'll highlight right here, a feature that came through conversations with manufacturers, really to the point I made when I started, which is our report is a snapshot in time, and new evidence is often available after a product has been on a market for a period of time. We now have the ability for a manufacturer of the product. So say BioMarin wanted to come back in 3 years and had better data, specifically on the clinical side, maybe on the adverse event side, they wanted to put that in here and show that their drug is actually worth more than what we had modeled in the beginning. That manufacturer now has the ability to submit that updated price back to the evidence compendium that Steve was demoing, so that when payers and other users are in there saying, okay, what's the ICER calculation of a fair price? There's now a row that would say the manufacturer's alternative price with a way to download the PDF and see all the changes that were made in the model. But this is really further to our whole idea of this being a neutral space. This is Switzerland. This is where both payers and manufacturers can come, talk about new evidence, talk about evidence specific to their populations to know exactly what they're targeting in terms of a fair price in service to fair access for patients. All right, in the last few minutes, what I want to demonstrate is the budget impact model. Now, what you want to do is hit this tab on the gray side, but then you also want to change it over here on the white side, because this is where you're going to see the answers change based on the inputs you have. So right now, and I often look at the per member per month impact as a judgment of what's happening with the introduction of a new therapy. We know that the prevalence of hemophilia A isn't very high, and so that for an individual payer, the PM impact of just this one gene therapy is modest. And because it's offsetting and there's a cumulative effect of more and more patients getting it over time, you actually see PM savings with the base case that we have. So this is assuming, I've made a couple of tiny tweaks, but this is assuming a price around 1.9 million. You could stop here if this is what you were interested in, just kind of tailoring this to the prevalence in your population and getting a sense of the budget impact that you might experience, but you can make more detailed changes to the budget impact. Again, this was based on feedback that we received about how to make the platform more useful for our users. Here you can change the uptake. We do a 20% at a year linear uptake as our base case for budget impact. You could change that, make that custom, and say, I think there's going to be some hesitation maybe in the patient and clinical community, but we're going to see uptake jump in year 3. And it's a little bit gray, but you can see how this is actually changing the PMPM calculations because the percent of patients taking the drug over years has changed. I'm going to go back to linear just as we play with the rest of it. You can also, when you're in a platform that has several different comparators, you can change the market baseline dynamics and that reflect your population for the comparators. In this case, ME is the one comparator, so we've got that there. But if we were looking at the atopic dermatitis model, you might see in a couple of places where we could say, I have more patients on Dupixent than I do on these other newer agents or on standard therapy, and so I might want to vary that. And the cost tab allows you to model the impact of introducing the therapy at particular price points with particular cost sharing choices and from a plan design perspective, and see how that impacts your PMPM. In this case, we know gene therapy is, a lot of them will be billed on the medical side. This isn't really a formulary placement decision, but like I was mentioning, atopic dermatitis might be, and you'd be able to model what would happen if I changed the new entrant in atopic dermatitis to maybe tier 4 and a 20% coinsurance, and I kept Dupixent at tier 2 in the preferred brand tier at a $20 a month copay. You can see how that would change the answer for the patient's responsibility, but then also your PMPM over time. All right, that's a whirlwind tour of the interactive modeler. A few things before we head over to the Q&A. A reminder to use the Q&A box if you have any questions for Steve and I as we wrap up today. Emphasizing that the models that exist in the interactive modeler should be thought of as disease models. They're not specific. They don't need to only be specific to the intervention that we have modeled. So if you are a developer with an asset in development for hemophilia A, this model could be helpful as you're thinking about your clinical program and your pricing strategy. Okay, if I use the ICER model as my base case and I model some of these different cost saving scenarios, but I put in the effectiveness data for my particular asset, what am I looking at in terms of what ICER might say a fair price is, or what I might need to be thinking about from a payer negotiation perspective. The other thing I'll mention is that as we do more and more gene therapies, we are really focused on the reality of the financing mechanisms that we need in order to be able to offer gene therapies to the patients who need them. And that comes down to outcomes-based contracts. So when applicable, we're also building into the platform the ability for the user to modify how an outcomes-based contract might work for their particular population. So I would encourage the existing users of ICER Analytics to take a look at the Zynteglo beta thalassemia model. And we modeled a refund of 80% at 5 years if any patients have to go back on transfusions. Maybe you're getting that deal, maybe you're not. Being able to toggle between some of the different assumptions on an outcomes-based contract is also another benefit. All right, let's take a look at the Q&A with our final minutes here and see what we've got. I have a question. This is a great question. Explain a little bit more about what you mean between the cost offset going to the manufacturer and going to society. Great question. When we think about when cost effectiveness is used to establish a fair price, it's not just judging what the fair extra spend is for health gain. It's also giving credit to that drug for any cost savings or cost offsets that happen over the lifetime of patient. That's kind of considered fair from a cost effectiveness perspective. If this drug for hepatitis C avoids the need for liver transplants later, some of that value should go into our calculation of fair price. When we're talking about, in this case, a gene therapy that has a really large amount of the value because it is precluding the need for expensive care year after year after year, we have a philosophical conversation that we can have about how much of the credit for offsetting that expensive care should be reflected in the price that the manufacturer gets to charge versus how much of that is something that should be social surplus that's shared with society. So it's a philosophical approach, and I would reference everyone to ICER's white paper on single and short-term therapies based on a series of conversations we had with stakeholders about how to tackle this particular issue. I think I've got time for just one more question. There's a question about our agreement with America's Health Insurance Plans, AHIP, that we announced last year, where AHIP members now have free access to the platform. It's a benefit of their membership in AHIP. I'm pleased to share with everyone that we've got about 30 AHIP members spanning both large, medium, and small plans that are in the platform, actively using it to work on their P&T decisions, inform conversations about negotiation and fair pricing, and then also using the interactive modeler for the calculation of what a fair price is for their particular population. All right, with that, we thank everybody for their attention today, their interest in ICER and the ICER Analytics platform. We are always looking for feedback and comments and suggestions. We're also available to set you up with a free trial. And so just email analytics@icer.org. We would love to get you into the platform if you're not there already. And if you are and you have some suggestions for how we can improve the platform, we want to hear that too. So my thanks to everybody for your attention today, and we'll talk to you all soon.